Number 1. Corn Road. I ran away from home when I was 15 years old. My parents were horrible. As far as I know, they still are. I never reconciled with them and really have no desire to. I had a little bit of money saved up over the years, but not much. I knew it would be hard, but not nearly as hard as staying at home. I lived in the Midwest and was making my way towards California. I chose to hitchhike my way there, and there were a lot of adventures plus some hard times along the way. I was walking down a long country road. If you've never been cross-country through the United States before, you might be surprised about how much corn there was. I was hiking along the road with what seemed like endless and endless miles of corn, but those roads were the best places to hitchhike along because of how nice country folk were about stopping and picking people up. And for the most part, hitchhiking is not the nightmare that Hollywood would like you to think that it was. But I had a horrifying experience once. I was walking at dusk, thinking it will be hard to find a ride that night. After a period of time, right after it got completely dark outside, a car passed me and then suddenly pulled over. They flashed their lights, which indicated I was getting a ride. I got into the passenger seat and thanked the man for the ride. Although older than me, he was a pretty young guy. He looked like he might have been around college age. I was wondering if he was on his way to school or something. We talked a bit and found out that we had a bit in common. He had actually left home also, although he was over 18, so he was not technically a runaway. But he had issues with his parents. He, unlike me, had a car though. Still, when he began talking about leaving, he seemed more upset about it than I did. For me it was easy, and I didn't miss my family at all. But his emotions seemed a lot more raw than mine were. He was more upset and more emotional. And the more we talked about it, the more I would start feeling concern. As we drove on, through the darkened fields of corn, I tried changing the subject a few times, but it would always drift back to what had upset us both enough to get us to run away. After we had driven and talked a little bit, I noticed headlights up in the distance coming in our direction. No big deal at first, until the driver began acting really weird. "Let me show you something," he told me. Before I could ask what, he reached over and turned his headlights off. I immediately panicked. It was too dark on that road with a car coming in our direction. I asked him what he was doing, and he told me this would be good for the both of us. I can't think about how terrified I was and actually be able to convey it, but I also didn't actually believe he was going to put us in danger. The headlights were getting closer, and the only thing that kept me from freaking out was the fact that we were in different lanes, but I was still very, very nervous. What happened next seemed like bullet time to me. The driver pulled into the other lane. I was shocked and I had almost no time to react, but I instinctively did. I grabbed the steering wheel and pushed it further towards the left. I know why I did it, because that was the direction it was going, and I wouldn't have to fight him to turn it. The car drove into the ditch, avoiding a collision. The other car drove past unscathed. I was expecting the driver to be mad at me for spoiling his suicide attempt. He was not, though. He began thanking me profusely, telling me he didn't know what had come over him. I helped get the car out of the ditch and back on the road. We drove for a day or two, actually, his moment of psychosis being just that. He didn't try it again. We parted ways a couple days later, and that was the last time I saw him. Number 2. Thief. I ran away from home when I was a teenager, and I had a nightmarish experience doing it. I didn't grow up in an abusive household or anything like that. My family was actually pretty well off. They were not mean to me, but they weren't really around a whole lot. Most of the things I needed were taken care of. but I really didn't get a lot of attention from them. In fact, I really couldn't even get in trouble. If I did something that was bad, it was normally forgotten about right away. I didn't grow up as a bratty kid though, so maybe that had something to do with it. I began hanging out with a group of guys who were always looking for some sort of excitement. After a while with them, I had started smoking and smoking pot. I don't consider either of those a big deal. It's just that I had changed a lot. There were things I did that I would never have considered earlier. And I found it weird, though, that my parents didn't seem to notice. And I guess, looking back on it, that may have been the thing that bothered me the most. Because I began doing other things and trying to make it obvious that I was doing them, to see if my parents would notice. But they never did. I guess that just got me into taking bigger risks. The group of friends and I began to steal things out of cars. They would break in to steal CDs to sell. They didn't do it because they needed the money, really. It was just because they were bored. But I didn't know that then. I was supposed to meet one of my buddies at a local store, and he didn't show up. When I used a payphone to call him, I found out that he had been arrested. That of course worried me, but I didn't think I should be concerned until I was walking back home and noticed 2 police cars outside of my house. As a 16-year-old, I guess I should have just taken my medicine, but I was scared then, and instead I ran off. I was too scared to even be in town, so when I got to the train station, I jumped on and bought myself a ticket all the way to the city. It might seem like I was overreacting a bit, but it didn't seem that way to me at the time. I had been stealing things for months, so I had months of anxiety about the possibility of getting caught. Now that we were caught, we really didn't know how bad it could be. And the last thing I wanted to do was get caught and go to jail. And yeah, I know, I should have thought about that before I went and started stealing things. If you were thinking that, you are absolutely right. I really was lost as to what to do. I couldn't go to my friends' houses. As far as I was aware, there could have been any number of police officers over at all their houses too, and I really didn't want to take any risks. I didn't know what to do when I got off the train. I got out and began wandering around, having no idea where to go, as I had never been in the city alone before. I also had no idea where to go. I also had no idea what to do. I spent the time walking around thinking about how stupid I had been and how it was completely stupid of me getting myself into this situation. Lost in my thoughts and my worries, I completely lost any sense of where I was going. The train station itself was not in the greatest part of town, so it was not like I had wandered into the bad part of town. I had a little bit of cash, so I decided to get myself a hotel room. I could then think out my strategy as to what to do next. I checked myself into a place, but was possibly more scared in there than I had been on the streets. But I was able to eventually get some sleep. I slept all the way until checkout time, and although I thought that I would simply try and go back home, I mean, at least the police couldn't still be there, I did end up changing my mind. There was no reason for my family not to turn me in, and even if they didn't, surely the school would when I went back to classes. I just found out that I couldn't go home because I didn't want to go to jail. Although I had no idea what I was going to do, I knew going home would not be it. I couldn't take going to jail. I only had a little bit of money left and knew that I couldn't get another hotel room. I needed to get food. I tried riding on the subway a lot, even taking naps on there when it was possible. But that was difficult with all the light and noise and movement. Plus I found out quickly that you couldn't stay on there all the time. Homeless people get shooed off, and not being able to get real rest made walking around even more miserable. I finally began sleeping in alleys. It was more difficult and scary than anything I had experienced before, but even though I didn't know it was possible, it could and did get scarier. On this night, I was looking for the right place to sleep. I made my way down an alley and found a wall to lean up against. It was a corner, so I felt comfortable resting into it. I was so exhausted that I fell asleep immediately, and it was mild enough weather-wise outside so that I was comfortable enough to sleep pretty sound and deep. I was really confused when I got pulled out of sleep. I had been sleeping so deeply that I was groggy. There were hands on me and they were pulling me up from the ground. Someone was holding me and shaking me and yelling at me in words that I couldn't understand. I tried getting away, but whoever it was had been holding me too strong. He kept yelling at me, but I could only make out the occasional word. All I could tell is that this was another homeless person who seemed to be angry at me for sleeping in the spot that he usually sleeps in. I struggled to get away, but this guy was much bigger than me. He kept slamming me up against the wall over and over again, but because I was in a corner, I couldn't get away. At one point, when I was hit up against the wall, my ankle bent the wrong way, and I fell down on my hands and knees. It gave me a moment to try and get away from the guy. I thought if he was only upset because I was in his spot, he would leave me alone as I ran off. However, as I was getting to my feet, I noticed the guy taking a pocket knife out of his jacket. I started thinking that he wanted to revenge for me taking the spot, as weird as that seemed. However, he might have just been trying to get me to run away. And as I stumbled to my feet, I did my best to get away. But I was wrong. The guy, still babbling half incoherently, came after me. He obviously was not just trying to scare me off, he wanted to actually hurt me. I ran down to the street, which was residential, and then tried to run down over to the street to a busier road. There are a lot of good things about living in the city when you're not homeless, but the most convenient thing on this night were the availability of police cars. The raving lunatic was still after me when I noticed a cop car sitting in the parking lot of the 7-Eleven I had run up to. That was when it hit me. 2 weeks before, I had run away from the police, who were only there to help the people who me and my buddies had stolen from. I had run away from them, and now I needed their help. I could have ran into the store and just waited for the guy to leave me alone, but that is when I realized I had to make things right. I let the police officer know I was 16 years old and a runaway. Although he couldn't arrest me for the thefts outside of his jurisdiction, he did have to contact my parents. They came and got me, and I returned home, which was basically heaven compared to what I had been through. I pled guilty to the theft and had to perform community service and pay restitution, so I had to get a job. But I paid everything off and did all of my service to try and make up for the things that I had done. Number 3, close call. When I was in high school, it was a small town in the far suburbs of a metropolis. I won't say exactly where, except the place was in a climate that was pretty cold in the winter. That's sort of important later in my story. I was 16 years old when this happened. My name is Sean, and this happened in the early 90s. I went to school in a school that at first didn't have any LGBTQ individuals who were out of the closet. Of course, that was before Kyle transferred to the school. It was during his sophomore year, and he wasn't out then. But he came out during his junior year in a school newspaper article. When Kyle came out, there were a few threats from homophobic guys. I overheard people talking about beating him up, or even a few extreme things like hanging him. Oddly enough, Kyle didn't care. He had a lot of friends, many of them punk rockers, but beyond that, he really never seemed scared of anyone. During a school basketball game, a sophomore who had called him gay knocked him on the floor of the gym and laughed at him, calling him a fag. That sophomore had to go to the nurse's office after Kyle beat the living shit out of him. And when he did it, he apparently had appeared to snap, and since then everyone was too scared to ever say anything to piss him off. He got known as the school psycho, and he loved that. So why am I telling you about Kyle? Well, mostly because I envied him quite a bit. I was a sophomore then, and he was a junior. He was adorable. He looked almost exactly like a young Harry Connick Jr. In fact, once during a lip sync contest we had in school, he took place in it, and he got dressed up. I thought he looked so much like Harry Connick Jr. that I expected him to sing one of his songs, but he didn't. Kyle was absolutely comfortable about being gay. I had heard him talk about it before, and he never struggled with it when he realized it. He just accepted himself right away. All of his friends had no problem with it. No one really gave him a hard time about it. But despite the fact that we had many of the same friends, I didn't have as easy a time with it as he did. It was confusing to me at first, and I told a few of my friends that I thought I might be gay, but I also asked them not to tell anyone. Kyle and I literally sat beside each other in study hall and talked and joked around and gave the teacher a hard time, but I never told him. I thought maybe he'd be happy knowing he was not the only gay kid in school. This wasn't like now when kids are openly gay everywhere in school. But for some reason I never told him. I think the reason why could have been my parents. They were always making homophobic jokes, and I absolutely didn't want to tell them. I knew Kyle's family knew, and they didn't care. Despite the fact that we had a kid in school who was accepted, not only by his family and his friends, I just couldn't convince myself that would ever happen for me too. I didn't find the same happiness with myself that he did, but I wanted to make it clear that none of my following choices were any fault of his. I doubt he would ever remember me today. Well, I met some gay guys using dating services. It was always older guys at first, and I lied about my age. It wasn't until after about a month of meeting these guys that I ended up meeting another kid about my age who was also pretending to be older in order to use the service. The guy I met, Terry, was absolutely a great difference than the older guys. We only fooled around once, but we decided we were better as friends, so I would hang out with him quite a bit. He didn't live at home, but didn't really give me a lot of information other than his phone number. I was lucky to make him as a friend because it didn't take long for me to be caught up using that dating line. When my parents found out, there was a huge fight, and yeah, it was over whether or not I was gay. I denied it at first, something I would never do today, but I ended up admitting to it eventually. I also snapped at my father when he used the word fag to describe me. I yelled at him to never use that word, and he slapped me for raising my voice to him. I lost it then. I started yelling and screaming really loud, and even my dad looked scared for a moment. I took a hammer out of his toolbox, which was in the room. I remember yelling at him to hit me again, and I would bust his head in. And then, out of control myself, I went to the door, slamming it, and stomped down the road. I called up Terry and asked him if I could sleep over at his place. I told him what happened and all. He said I could and that he would come and get me, which he did. I didn't have a car, but he told me he would pick me up. While I was waiting for him, I noticed my dad's pickup truck coming down the road. I felt a bit terrified because of what had happened, and I don't know exactly why I did it, but I decided to hide from him. I just had a strong feeling that that was what I should do. He drove by without knowing I was there. I left and moved in with my friends. Life took a lot of turns over the years, but those were not important. Years later, I got back in touch with my brother, and we talked about the night I left. We were talking about why he didn't talk to our dad anymore. Apparently, the night I left, he told the family no son of his was going to be gay. He took his gun and went after me. For years, my family actually thought that he had killed me and disposed of my body. I let my brother know that I had hidden when I noticed the truck coming. He told me that he truly believed that if I had not hidden, I would be dead. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here, If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.
What's your best true spooky story? Serious. At the time I was around 14. I'd asked my dad to wake me up early that morning at about 5 a.m. because I had some work to get done. That morning, I was woken up, and I flung my legs over the side of my bed. I felt a tug on both of them. What I thought at the time was just my dad trying to get me to hurry up. I reached over to pick up my phone and turned it on, 3:30 a.m., and I looked over at the black figure I assumed was my dad, and it was gone. I've posted this on my other account. Copying and pasting it here. The scariest thing I've had happen while camping. So I live in Eastern Oregon, and my mom lives in Western Oregon. I went to visit her for the summer and she's very outdoorsy, so we decided to take the 1-hour drive from her city to the coast. We end up at this free campsite at the top of this hill, huge foothills of the coastal mountains, about a 25-minute drive from the top where the campsite is to the bottom where the main road was, and we were the only campers there. We relaxed for the rest of the day, made food, etc. A truck full of men drive up the hill and talk with my mom. What about, wasn't suspicious at the time, and they leave us. Fast forward to the middle of the night. I wake up to my mom sitting straight up in the tent. I wake easily, so I heard her gasp and it woke me. As soon as she saw I was awake, she put her hand over my mouth because I was starting to ask her what's wrong. It was dead silent, and all of a sudden you hear footsteps right beside the tent. The little flap that covers the zipper was even moving. Thankfully, my mom has quick wits and said very loudly, "Kenny, grab the gun." Kenny is my dad, although that doesn't matter, and mind you, he was not there, just us girls like I previously said. They left. No harm was done. Thank the Lord for my mama. 4 years ago, I lived in a very large farmhouse that was converted into 2 apartments. The house was known as the Old Boys' Home. It was used to house boys with behavioral issues but was closed due to allegations of molestation. Anyway, I was living with my boyfriend and 3-year-old daughter at the time. My bedroom had a large fireplace that had been boarded up and painted over. I decided to push my bed up against it one day while I was rearranging things. It was like a headboard. That night, around 1 a.m., I had heard a small voice saying, "Mom, Mom, Mommy." I had sat up in bed but didn't see anything, so I reached over my boyfriend trying to grab my daughter and put her in our bed. I kept feeling around, and I was still hearing the voice but I couldn't feel her. My boyfriend woke up and turned the bedside lamp on, asking me, "What the hell are you doing?" I explained that Amelia was trying to get in our bed and I was reaching for her. There was nobody there. My daughter was sound asleep in her room. Then the next night came. Around 1 a.m. again my dog had started to whimper at outdoor, so my boyfriend got up to take him outside. You know that feeling in a bed when someone lies down next to you? Where the bed pushes in and there is a warmth in your back? I felt that. So I assumed my boyfriend had come back to bed. I rolled over. My boyfriend wasn't in the bed and I felt the freaking bed release pressure. Whatever was laying next to me has gotten up in that second. I moved my bed the next day to the other side of the room and I never had another incident in the 2 years I remained in that house. When my grandparents bought their house for a family of 10, my grandpa found a fake wall upstairs. He tore it down to make more room for the family. Behind the wall were children's clothes and play toys, almost like they walked off the room in a hurry. My mom told me stories of sitting in her room and something circling the walls around her, sounding like wallpaper being torn. When she moved out, my aunt moved into the same room. She would wake up with pictures she hung up laying on her chest in the morning. My cousins also have stories of hearing footsteps coming up the stairs and stopping outside their door in the middle of the night. I still don't go upstairs at their house because it's always cold and I get weird vibes up there. Even in my adult life I have scary dreams that take place in their upstairs. I posted this in a thread a while ago but gonna do it again because it applies here. When I was in high school, my uncle would throw me a couple bucks to help babysit his kids with my aunt. They lived in a 2-story house by the water, nice area. The kids were about 3 and 6. One day I was sitting in their den on my phone, when I started to hear a baby crying. Thinking it was the 3-year-old, I headed to the bottom of the stairs to check and see if my aunt was up there dealing with it. I called for her a couple times with no response. The baby kept crying. I called for her one more time, and when I got no response I started walking up the stairs. Then I heard my cousins and aunt playing outside. All the hairs on my body stood up and I literally felt a chill run down my spine. I quietly turned around, walked down the stairs, got in my car and drove away. The baby was still crying when I closed the door behind me. A few years later I was drunk at a family party and told my uncle the story. He told me that he and his wife used to hear the baby too, and apparently the previous owners had a kid die of SIDS in that room upstairs. He's uber Catholic and had a mass said for the baby. He said after that it never happened again. Still gives me the willies when I talk about it though. Back when I was a kid my grandmother had a really close friend who used to help her babysit us. One day she goes missing. Family doesn't know where she is and we don't either. About a week later, police find her body in a dumpster. She had been dead for 4 to 5 days. She had been mugged and had several stab wounds. Incredibly tragic. Who would mug an old lady? Here's the spooky story. A few days just before she was found, my 3 cousins swore they saw her walking around in their backyard and knocking on their window. The following day had search going through the area. It wasn't until the body was found that we realized what they saw couldn't be true according to police timeline, but they swore it was her. I have a bunch, but I think the best one I have actually happened to my mom. We lived in a very creepy, very old house when I was little. One day my mom was cleaning my little brother's room while we were at school, and every single one of his electronic toys turned on all at once. 2 of them did not have batteries in them. She was so freaked out she had us camp out in the living room for 3 days because she didn't want my brother alone in his room. Up until we moved, that would occasionally happen. Either 1 or 2 toys at a time. Freshman year at my university. We had a creepy, old dorm on campus that no one was living in. Everyone generally avoided it because it just had an uncomfortable feeling when you got close to it and felt like you were being watched. There are rumored stories about 2 women dying there on separate occasions. 1 murder, 1 suicide. And they're the ones who haunt the building. One night, a friend was in a bad mood because his girlfriend had broken up with him, so I was walking around campus with him to let him get it off his chest and just trying to help him feel better. We walked past the dorm and I brought it up about it being haunted, and was telling him the stories to try and take his mind off it. So, the way the bottom floor was set up, there were 2 doors on both sides of the building, and the hallway ran the entire length of the building and you could see the other door. We walked up to one of the windows and were just looking down the hall when 2 girls walked out of a room, wearing clothes that looked like they were from the 70s/80s and stood there in the hall looking at each other, not speaking. Then, one girl slowly turned her head and looked straight at us, slowly turned her head back, then turned and walked the opposite way from us down the hall. So we ran to the other side of the building, but we couldn't find them. We came back to the original door. And watched them do the same thing all over again. We looked at each other and ran. This freaked me out for a while, especially after, when I was sleeping in my room and all my posters fell off the wall at the same time. After telling this story to another friend, he convinced me to go back with him and try to find a way in. We found an open window, which we later found out was the room the girl hung herself in, and climbed in and started walking down the hall. We wandered around the building a bit and just started to notice generally creepy things. Water faucets started coming on, we'd walk through one room and then back through and a chair would be moved. On the first floor, a desk was turned upside down under the stairwell. As we were getting close to leaving, a lot more water faucets came on and kept getting louder and louder. Then when we got back to the room to go back out of the window, and as we put our hands on the window, the door slammed closed. So we ripped the door open, dove out and ran back to our dorm. And never went back. My high school used to be a giant mansion before it was converted into an orphanage and then a high school. One section of the school, the third floor, was inaccessible. The staircase which led to the floor was blocked off with wood and painted black to match the chorus room where it was located. In 2003, during the fall school show of Les Mis, they had to remove the wood so they could replace the windows on that third floor. We even ended up using some of the removed windows for our barricade. We had play practice most nights, and, if you lived far enough away, usually you would just stay at the school and wait, rather than go home just to come right back up. While waiting for practice to start one night, myself and 3 friends, Ryan, Mike, and Michelle, decided to go up the staircase to check out the third floor. The staircase was rotted and falling apart from years of disuse, so we carefully went up one at a time to find an unremarkable hallway with some even less remarkable rooms off to the sides. All of this led into a big open area with old, stacked desks and folders full of test papers from like the 80s or something. The 4 of us were a bit disappointed, because the rumor was that this section of the school was not converted from the orphanage that occupied the space several decades earlier, and the ghosts of orphans still haunted the place. Since we didn't get spooked, we ended up just digging through the old papers. While Michelle was looking through the papers in a side room with her back to us, Ryan pushed Mike and myself out of the room quietly and into an adjacent room to scare Michelle into thinking we disappeared. Sure enough, she comes bolting out of the room screaming at us, throwing out, "Screw you guys," and, "This isn't funny." We had to muffle our mouths to keep from laughing, when, all of a sudden, one of the people in the room effing ruined the whole thing by giggling like a little girl. I turned to Ryan and Mike to see which one of them ruined the joke, but both of their hands were over their mouths and their eyes were wide as dinner plates. This room we were in, hiding behind the door, was small. Maybe the side of a small, one-stall bathroom. Maybe that's what it was once upon a time. And somebody in this god-darn tiny room was giggling and it was none of us. This whole plot played out in probably like 10 seconds between leaving Michelle and hearing the giggle. So we stood there staring at each other waiting for something to happen that explained this. It was like 4 or 5 p.m. and we were the only ones in the chorus classroom the entire day. We would have seen someone go upstairs. We would have heard the stairs creaking as they went up there. Whoever giggled at us from inside that room was up there already. Unfortunately, we didn't get the explanation we needed because a second set of giggles started happening, this time more than one person making them. That was it for Ryan, a big, tough former athlete turned show kid, who screamed the highest pitch scream I've ever seen a guy that size make. It would have been funny if we weren't terrified. He pushed past us, ran screaming out into the hallway, scared the daylights out of Michelle on his way down and we bolted down the steps. This time, we did not take them one by one and actual chunks of rotted wood started falling off. We explained what happened to Michelle, and then went somewhere that was not the Chris classroom until play practice started. The maintenance team must have known we were up, because we all collectively got a talking to about going up there. Safety concerns with the rotted steps. So of course, people started going up there willy-nilly hoping to see a ghost. There are more stories about that third floor during that year that promptly stopped once they replaced the windows and sealed the room back up. Now the school is closed and empty, so whatever ghosts were having a good time are now free to do so without the living getting in the way. About 5 years and 2 boyfriends ago, I moved into an old farmhouse with my then significant other. He was a hoarder and was embarrassed about the state his house was in after his wife left him. He had an RV and that's where he slept, because there was just crap, garbage, clothes, boxes, up to your knees in every room of the house. Me, being extremely distressed by clutter, cleaned that house. Down to cobwebby corners of the ceiling. It took me weeks, but I Murphy's oiled every inch of wood, filled his truck with over 10 loads of garbage. The very first night I was there, things were weird. At that point I had only cleared part of the living room. The boyfriend snored unbearably loud, so I opted to sleep inside, on the couch, while he slept out in his camper. I had just had a fight with my mother, and was lying awake around 4 a.m. fuming about it. I heard my boyfriend come in the back door, muttering to himself as usual. He was opening and closing drawers and cabinets in the kitchen, figured he was searching for something. Finally, I got up because hell, I was already awake, maybe I could help him find whatever it was. The kitchen was 5 feet from where I was, and when I walked in, there was no one there. I looked around and called for him, but he wasn't there. I don't get scared easily, and at this point I was just curious about where he was. I went out the camper and could hear him snoring hard before I even got to the door. I shook him awake and asked him gently what he had needed in the house. He said he hadn't left the camper all night. I thought, he was sleepwalking. When I went back inside though, I noticed it had snowed lightly in the night, and the only tracks leading up to the camper were mine. Couple days later, I moved my 2 cats in. They are super on edge, a lot of growling, acting out of character, especially in the middle of the night. I completely dismissed that as it was a new, unfamiliar place. Obviously they were uncomfortable. I had finally gotten the bedroom habitable and they would not cross the threshold into it. The first night we slept in the bedroom, was when I started to fear the house. The bed was up against a window that faced out to the cornfield, and my guy insisted on sleeping on the outside of the bed, leaving me pressed against the window. I got this horrible feeling. Something was right outside the window and I was frantic to the point of tears. I kept telling him there was something out there and he said I was being dramatic, which was stupid, because I'm just not. You spend your whole life being logical and calm, and when something weird happens, no one believes you. I slept on the couch. The next day, I noticed a handprint on the top of the bedroom window that I had just cleaned the day prior. I held my hand up to it and it was thrice the size of my own hand, bigger than any person's handprint I've ever seen. It wasn't just a print, though, it was elongated, as if the hand had dragged down the window. Still could be an explanation. Even though I had cleaned that window the day before and would have noticed. Except the print was over 9 feet off the ground directly over an open coal cellar. I showed my boyfriend and he told me something surprising. His ex-wife thought there was something wrong with the house too. She was making dinner one day and he had gotten home from work, her back was turned to him and they had a full conversation. Then she looked out the kitchen window and saw him pull up in his truck. He still blew it off with me, just telling me I was paranoid and such. All this time, I assumed he was right, dismissed my instincts and went about things normally. Then, one morning in the spring, I got up to use the bathroom. It was 4:46 in the morning, and I knew the time because I checked my phone when I got up. The whole bedroom was lit from the sunrise and I quietly climbed back into bed. The house is all wood paneling, and because of my arachnophobia I had the bed scooted about 5 inches away from the wall where our heads were. I laid down and tucked my arm up under the pillow with my hand over the edge. The second I closed my eyes, an icy cold hand grabbed me by the wrist and yanked down hard. I bolted up and in a state of complete terror, shook my boyfriend awake and asked if he was screwing with me. He wasn't. I will never forget that grip because I had to struggle to get my hand back. I called my close friend and she said, "You know that there's a cemetery within view of your bedroom, right?" I had forgotten, but being a practical person it had never occurred to me that there might be a connection. She said, "Let's try something." Came over with a sage brush and we smudged the house. We were both laughing at ourselves as we did it, but the thing is, nothing weird happened after that. Well, except me falling into a hole in the floor. But I blamed that on my own clumsiness. The relationship withered, I moved out, but we remain friends. He says nothing strange has happened since I left. In high school my friends and I were messing around with a Ouija board one night. We had done it before and nothing remarkable had ever happened. We usually did it to try and scare each other or our girlfriends. We all thought it was a joke. That night, there was no one else home except the 7 of us, and we were all together around the board. One of the girls there wanted to try it. She had never done it before. This time was different. The board misspelled some of the words the same way every time. It gave answers that seemed really historically accurate for our town. Things we neither knew or cared about. Long story short, the spirit claimed it was a 10-year-old boy who had died on the property in the 1800s and was buried there too in an unmarked grave. My friend's house was on a farm in the edge of town. We were all a little freaked out because the board had never been so detailed and consistent. However, we were still skeptical, and we were all assuming one of us was trying to scare the rest. Finally, my friend asked if the spirit could do something to prove he was there with us. It went to yes, and then spelled out, knock. Then the planchette stopped moving. We just all stared at it silently and then there was a rap on the window right next to us. The lights were on outside and there was absolutely no one out there. We never touched that effing board again.